Mr. President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to engage in a colloquy with my Republican colleagues for 60 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to talk about an amendment that's had lots of attention. It's an amendment that I offered on the floor a couple of weeks ago, and we weren't able, the leader didn't want to get to it at the time, but the majority leader brought it up for me yesterday, and I'm glad he did. I'm glad we're able to talk about it. This is an amendment that would allow religious belief or moral conviction to be an important factor in whether or not people comply with new health care mandates. Now, we have long, Mr. President, had this exemption for hiring mandates, and in fact, when I served in the House of Representatives, I'd been the president of a Southern Baptist university. I understood the importance of these institutions. I thought maintaining their faith distinctives as part of why they provide education and health care and daycare and other things. And so I have long been an advocate of a principle that the Supreme Court held up just a few weeks ago, 9-0, that there is a difference in these faith-based institutions. And now that we have health care mandates that could apply to these institutions, all this amendment does is extend the same privilege to them and others who have a religious belief or moral conviction that would they'd be able to defend their moral conviction. We don't do anything about the mandate itself. It's important to understand, Mr. President, that the administration, this one or any other, if the Affordable Health Care Act is still in force, can issue all the mandates that the act would allow. And in fact, if you don't comply with those mandates, you'd have the penalties that the act would allow. But the difference is if the government wouldn't recognize your religious belief or moral conviction, as I think they would likely do. For example, the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. saying this is something we have long held as a tenet of our faith that we don't believe should happen and we shouldn't be part of, and we don't want it to be part of the insurance policies of our schools or our hospitals. My guess is if we pass this amendment, without any question, the Justice Department would say, well, you're certainly going to be able to defend that because that's been your belief for centuries in your faith. This amendment doesn't mention any procedure of any kind. In fact, just this morning, we had a reporter call the office and said, we can't find the word contraception in this amendment anywhere. How's this a vote on contraception? Of course, we were able to say, as we had said 4 days, the word contraception is not in there because it's not about a specific procedure. It's about a faith principle that the First Amendment guarantees. And Mr. President, this language, this exact language of religious belief or moral conviction was first used in 1973 in the Public Health Services Act, brought to the Senate floor by Senator Church from Idaho, who I believe was considered one of the liberals of the Senate at the time, protecting health care providers from having to be involved in procedures they didn't agree with. It's part of the Legal Services Corporation limitation in 1974, the Foreign Aid Funding limitation in 1986, the refusal to participate in executions or prosecutions of capital crimes in 1994, the vaccination bill that if you come to this country as a non-resident and you don't want to have vaccinations that are otherwise required, you don't have to have them if you have a religious belief or moral conviction against them. And the list, Mr. President, goes on and on. The Medicare and Medicaid Counseling Act, the Federal Employees Health Benefits Plan of 1998, the contraception coverage for federal employees in 1999, the D.C. contraception mandate in 2000, the United States Leadership Against AIDS Act in 2003. And then, Mr. President, it's this exact same language, even more specifically, has been in bills that weren't passed In 1994, Senator Moynihan from New York brought a bill to the floor that Mrs. Clinton, later Senator Clinton, now Secretary Clinton, was very involved in, this 1994 health discussion. And that bill said nothing in this title should be construed to prevent any employer from contributing to the purchase of a standard benefits package which excludes coverage for abortion or other services if the employer objects to such services on the basis of religious belief or moral conviction. This is Senator Moynihan less than 20 years ago in what was considered a liberal piece of legislation, putting what the country had thought since the beginning of government-paid health care was just a natural part of every health care bill. In fact, the bill we're talking about that this amendment would impact is the first time that the federal government has passed a health care bill that didn't include this language. The first time it didn't include this language. And, you know, if you're not offended by the current mandate that some religions are, I think it's important to think of what you would be offended by. What in your faith would be an offensive thing to be told you had to be part of, and then imagine the government saying, no, you have to be part of that. And even if you don't do it yourself, you have to pay for it. Or you have to be sure that your employees, your associates are part of this thing that is offensive to you because of religious belief or moral conviction. Now, before I go to my good friend Senator Johans, who understands this issue so well, let me also say that, as I said, Mr. President, we didn't eliminate the mandate, so you can still have the mandate. The federal government can still come in and say, you're not offering these services, so you have to pay the penalty. And then you have to be able to go to court and prove that you have a long-held belief that this is wrong. You know, the court in 1965, when this particular phrase became the boilerplate phrase for the law, the court said, you can't become a conscientious objector the day you get your draft notice, in essence. That you have to have these two principles. You have to have religious belief, strong moral conviction, and you have to be able to go to court and prove that. All of the fiction writers out there in fundraising letters and otherwise saying things like women who have contraceptive services today wouldn't have them, of course that's not true. Of course that's not true. The women that have those services today either have them because they've found a way to pay for them themselves, or they have an employer who's providing that as part of health care. That employer is not going to be able to turn around and say, I'm not for that anymore because I object for some religious reason that I didn't have all the time I was providing it. This is an important issue. It is a First Amendment issue. It's an issue that group after group after group think it violates the Religious Freedom Act, RFRA. There are 6 lawsuits already. I suspect that they have a good chance of prevailing because it does exactly what the religious freedom law says you can't do. It needlessly forces people to participate in activities that are against their moral principles, their religious principles. The circumstance in the country we have 220 years of history of this. We have almost 50 years of history of government-paid health care for one group or another that always included an exemption like this exemption. To not do this assumes that the government can make people do things that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and others specifically said were among the rights that we should defend the most vigorously, that we should hold the most dear, that we should not let a government interfere in these basic rights of conscience, a term of Thomas Jefferson when he wrote the New London Methodist in 1809. These rights of conscience are an area that we should not let the government get between the American people and their religious beliefs. And our laws since then, whether it's for hiring or in the case of any health care discussion, have always anticipated the protection of this First Amendment right. Not a specific thing, but again, if you're not offended by the things that some people are concerned about today, it's important to think of what you would be offended by. What your religious belief leads you to believe would be wrong, and how you would feel if the government says, now you have to be a part of that activity. And I'd like to turn to my good friend from Nebraska, who has been a real advocate of understanding the importance of the First Amendment and the role it plays in our society.